28-year-old Ketchum Caldwell was so stunned that he could not think clearly. There was a piercing noise in his head, like the roar of a river. He became dizzy and had to sit up to keep from falling. As he did, he almost hit the living room couch and had to catch himself to keep from falling to the floor. He could hear his wife Hayden saying something to him, but her voice sounded muffled and her words were jumbled. It felt like she was underwater. "What? What did you say?" "Listen, Ketch, honey, I'm sorry about what happened. But we were just talking about buying a house and starting a family. We've only been married for 5 years." "Honey, that didn't mean anything. I don't know how it even happened, but it had nothing to do with you or us. I'm sorry." That wasn't what Hayden had planned to say at all. It sounded so cheap. "Ketch, listen to me. I messed up." Ketchum jumped up from the couch and started pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He held both hands firmly to the sides of his head. He seemed to expect his head to explode at any second. Okay, I'm not sure how I should react. What am I supposed to say or do? I've never been in a situation like this before." "Honey, just sit back down. You're scaring me." Hayden tried to reach over and sit Ketchum back down on the couch, but he was having no luck. Ketchum became short of breath and felt the walls of the living room closing in around him. It felt like the air was being forced out of his lungs. "No, I need to get out of here to think this through. This is just too confusing for me." He headed for the door. "Wait!" she shouted. Hayden desperately wanted Ketch to stay. "How are we going to get through this if we don't talk about it?" She began to cry, begging him to stay. Ketchum answered nothing. He raised his hands in a defensive stance. Hayden realized that he didn't want her to touch him. Every time she tried to make physical contact, it upset him more, and she backed away. What on earth had she done? "Please, Ketch, I know we can work this out. Please, I'm begging you, don't go." It was too late. He was already gone. The slam of the front door sounded to Hayden like the end of her marriage. Hayden hadn't lied to Ketchum. She really didn't know how it happened. One minute she was having lunch with Preston McCall, and the next minute they were having sweaty, feverish animal sex on a creaky, slightly musty-smelling bed in an unremarkable motel off the main highway a couple hundred yards from the restaurant. Hayden and Preston were co-workers and regular dining partners, and until the moment they'd ended up in the same bed, she'd never had lustful thoughts about him. In fact, she considered Preston something of a father figure. Hayden had never had a father. At least not one that she could remember. She tried to remember her time with Preston. She had never had even a hint that Preston thought of her as anything other than a friend. He had never even made any hints or lewd jokes. Preston was the perfect gentleman. He was always considerate, if not a little shy. When she first met him at work, he always seemed sad and lonely. She had invited him to lunch because she felt he needed a friend. She enjoyed talking to him, and it became a regular lunch for both of them. The last thing she remembered was chatting and eating salad with Preston in their usual booth at the bistro where they often went for lunch. She talked about her fears about motherhood. He seemed genuinely interested and concerned about her fears. Hayden didn't know it, but the fear of not being able to be a good mother was a very common anxiety that most women experienced. It could be simply overwhelming at times. Preston tried to reassure her. He repeatedly told her that he thought she would make a great mother. As he explained his reasoning, he placed his hand on Hayden's arm and squeezed it lightly. It was an act of friendship. He was just trying to comfort her. Then one thing led to another. When Hayden came to, she was naked, covered in sweat and lying in a 69 pose. She couldn't believe that Preston had set out to seduce her. In fact, he was very apologetic about his involvement in their date. After they were done, but still in the motel room, Hayden broke down and sobbed hysterically over what she had done. When she told Preston that she had to tell Ketchum what she had done, he convinced her not to. "Hayden, listen to me carefully. I'm begging you. Do not tell Ketchum about this. I know what I'm talking about. My wife did something similar. When she confessed it to me, I exploded. It's not that I didn't appreciate her honesty, but I just couldn't accept what she did. So I divorced her. Call it my stupid male pride or ego or whatever, but I just couldn't let it go." He spoke sincerely and emotionally. A few months after my divorce was finalized and I got over my raging anger at my wife, I regretted my actions, but I was too confused or stubborn to talk to her. It's been 10 years now, and I still regret not giving her a chance to talk things out. I don't know if our marriage would have survived either way, but my refusal to even consider talking to her alienated me from my children and made them strangers. Our relationship has not recovered to this day. By the time I got up the courage to talk to her about it, she was already gone. Tears came to Preston's eyes as he recalled that horrible period of his life. He later learned that his ex-wife had remarried. In essence, she had passed away, leaving any memory of him behind. It's just your fear of motherhood, Hayden. I'm sure you've never done anything like this before and you won't do it again. Trust me. Please, Hayden. Men handle these things differently than women. Don't tell him, Hayden. I'm begging you. When you get home, just show your love for him. Try to be the best wife and mother you can be, and forget all of this. You are a good person who made a terrible mistake. Let it go. I think it's best if we don't go out to lunch for a while. I can't believe I put your marriage in jeopardy. Let's just forget about it and move on with our lives. Preston was remorseful. This was the hardest part of this whole story for Hayden. She was truly sorry for what she had done. But sex with Preston was exciting. How was she supposed to get over it? It was certainly better than sex with Ketch. She hadn't been a virgin when they'd married, but her only experience before marriage had been some very unsatisfying trysts in the back seat of a car with a high school boyfriend. How was she supposed to hide her betrayal from Ketch? She loved him with all her heart. However, she feared that she would never be able to make love to Ketch without remembering the incredible sex she'd had with Preston. The only way to survive this nightmare was to tell Ketch what had happened and why. Why? Hell, she didn't even know why it had happened. She had to talk to him. Maybe she could see a counselor to get a better understanding of why she'd done it. They could work it out, couldn't they? To complicate things further, she was leaning toward taking Preston's advice and keeping things quiet. But first, she decided to talk to her mother, with whom she had always had a very close relationship. Getting the expected shock and disapproving reaction from her mother, she received advice that was the exact opposite of what Preston had given her. Honey, listen to me. A marriage built on a big lie like this is bound to fail. This is supposed to be a partnership of love and trust. What happens if, for some reason, years from now, after you have children, Ketchum finds out what you've done? I can't imagine the sense of betrayal he would feel. He might even think you had kids so you wouldn't have to leave. It's too painful to even think about. No, you have to tell him. That's what Hayden did. And here was the reason why. She sat alone on the living room couch in tears, not knowing where her husband had gone. Never in her life had she felt so alone and scared. Ketchum, for his part, was a much more confused young man than his wife was a frightened woman. He had never thought Hayden capable of such a thing. His emotions fluctuated from rage to sadness to fear. Part of his soul wanted to kill her, and the other part wanted to ignore her, as if this was a terrible dream he would soon wake up from. He turned off his phone and decided to spend the night in a cheap hotel. He lay on the hard mattress with his hands behind his head and stared at the popcorn-style acoustic insulation soaked in tobacco smoke. He tried to distract himself from his problems by imagining that the haphazard pattern of the sprayed acoustic material were animal figures, but he was having no luck. It would require too much concentration from his brain. Ketchum realized that at some point he would have to talk to Hayden, but he didn't know what to ask. Did she love him? Did she want a divorce? How was a man supposed to behave in a situation like this? He tried to sort through his emotions. Anger, resentment, and sadness seemed the most prominent and appropriate. Getting over his anger was difficult. Finding her lover and physically assaulting him seemed childish, and even if he didn't end up in the hospital, he could end up in jail. If she was going to divorce him anyway, he didn't want to give her the pleasure of seeing her new man beat him up. Besides, for heaven's sake, he was an accountant, not a fighter. Besides, he felt awkward and inferior. Why did he feel that way? Could it be because he had done something wrong or had let Hayden down in some way? He couldn't think of what exactly. Maybe that was what he should ask her. Ketchum turned his phone back on and sent Hayden a text. He didn't bother to read any of the 6 messages she sent him. His message read, "I'm fine. I'll be home tomorrow morning to talk." He then turned his phone off. All night, he never got any sleep, and he never had a real plan. These omissions would prove to be critical mistakes. Since it was a Saturday, neither Hayden nor Ketchum had to work, and he got home around 11 in the morning. He parked in his assigned spot outside their apartment, but felt kind of awkward. He was exhausted and still didn't know what to say to his wife. Ketchum sat in the car for almost 15 minutes, occasionally glancing at Hayden through the curtains. He guessed he couldn't escape again. Finally, he worked up the courage to enter the house. When he reached the front door, he stopped in confusion. Strangely enough, he didn't know if he should knock before entering. What saved his lethargic brain from making a decision was when Hayden swung the door open and threw herself into his arms. She sobbed, apologized, and even hiccuped. Her reaction only confused him further. She led him into the living room while babbling some gibberish. Ketchum wasn't sure if it was really gibberish, but since his brain was pixelated, he only understood every third or fourth word she spoke. "Ketch, please sit here with me." And she patted the couch next to her. He just stared at her and remained standing. This was a very bad idea. There was no way he was ready for a serious conversation with Hayden. He uttered the only words that came to his mind in his dazed state. "What's his name, Hayden?" Hayden looked shocked. Hayden was just as confused as Ketch. She had thought out her speech beforehand and hadn't thought of that part. "His name isn't that important right now. I want us to talk about—" Now Ketch looked shocked. "Oh, well, I guess I didn't quite understand the situation. I'd better leave then." He immediately turned and walked out of the apartment without looking back. Hayden was stunned and slumped down on the couch. She was too surprised to call out to Ketch and stop him. What the hell just happened? What did I say wrong? Ketchum, on the other hand, had suggested that his marriage was over. She didn't want to tell him about her lover to protect him. To him, it meant she was in love with someone else. But what was the point of that? At least now he knew the position he was in. A few days later, Friday morning, Hayden sat in her office, no more productive than she had been on Monday. Preston thankfully paid no attention to her, only nodding politely and wishing her a good morning as they passed in the hallway. Hayden was fine with that. She had other things to worry about. She hadn't heard a peep from Ketchum, not a single phone call, not a single text or email. It was as if he'd vanished off the face of the earth. She had called him at work several times, but had never been able to reach him. She knew this was no accident and only added to her anxiety. "Hi. Oh, hey. I like that outfit on you." "What? Who are you?" Hayden stared at the girl with purple matted hair, a silver nose ring, and a tattoo of a pink unicorn on her left arm. She leaned against the door jamb of Hayden's office. "Oh, you must be Hayden Caldwell?" "Yes, what do you need?" "You've been served, sweetheart. Have a good day." The girl, dressed in grunge style, quickly snapped a picture with her phone, burst the bubble she'd inflated with bubble gum, and disappeared as she handed Hayden a rather thick manila envelope. Hayden pulled away from the envelope and stared at it like it was a venomous snake ready to strike at any moment. She didn't even notice that Preston had entered her office. He'd heard what had happened to the server. He'd been standing in front of her desk for almost 5 minutes now. When Hayden finally looked up at him, Preston had a sour expression on his face and shook his head sadly. "You shouldn't have told him, Hayden. You really shouldn't have. I'm sorry, I really am." Preston turned and walked away, still shaking his head. He headed straight to HR and quit without notice. Their divorce was finalized about 6 months later. Hayden didn't fight back. There was nothing to fight about. After paying her lawyer and half of her bills, she had about $700 left. She was sure Ketch was in the same situation, not much in 5 years of marriage. Throughout the divorce proceedings, Hayden had never seen Ketchum once. She didn't know where to find him. She tried to contact him at work the same day she was served with the summons. She was cheerfully told that Mr. Caldwell no longer works here. Countless phone calls to his family and friends proved fruitless. She was sure his parents and brother knew where he was, but they were silent. They hadn't been rude to her. They didn't yell or scream, but it was clear they wanted nothing to do with her. When she called her mom, she was sympathetic, but when Hayden asked if she could move in with her for a while, her mom simply said, "No." "No? What do you mean no?" "Please, Mom, I need help." "You have to figure things out on your own. And you won't be able to do that if you run home like a little girl who skinned her knee on the playground." "But, Mom, you told me to tell him." She was desperate and pleading. "You should have told him, honey. It was the right decision, but it didn't guarantee that you would stay married. I hope someday you'll understand why I told you to do it." Hayden was sure that her happy, safe, and orderly life was over. She had never felt so alone. 10 years later, "Preston, is that you?" It had been so long. She was stunned to see him here. The last time she'd heard, he lived hundreds of miles away. He was immersed in memories again. It seemed that these days his entire social life was spent alone in this cafe, where he pondered his troubled past and bleak future. That voice, that familiar, haunting voice, the memory that never let him go, that single moment in time that haunted him to this day. It was impossible. Hi, Shelley. A long time ago. Long time. Preston barely managed to get the words out. Wow. Unlike me, she still looked good. So young and vibrant and energetic. She must be 50 by now. Preston just stared at her. He had to assume he would see her someday. After all, their town wasn't that big. And he'd been back a long time. If Preston had led any sort of normal social life, their paths would probably have crossed long before now. Preston had barely spoken to her since their divorce. After that horrible time, he rarely had any contact with his children. He hadn't seen them in over 6 years. He only sent birthday and Christmas cards to his children and grandchildren who lived in different parts of the country. 3 of his grandchildren he had never met in person. Shelley tried to break the awkward silence. "Yeah, it's probably been 20 years, Preston." The uncomfortable silence continued. For her part, Shelley thought Preston looked old, lost, and tired. The world had not been kind to him. Disappointed and embarrassed by his unresponsiveness, she got ready to leave. But no sooner had she concealed herself than she noticed that tears had begun to form in Preston's eyes. She decided to stay and sat down uninvited. "What the hell is going on, Preston?" She didn't mean for it to sound so harsh. "I mean, why did you come back?" She stepped back. This seemed like the safest place to start. Preston shrugged indifferently. "I don't know. They closed the satellite office I was working at. So to avoid starting over, I decided to get a job here." He made a weak attempt at a joke. "You know, the insurance capital of the Northwest?" He laughed bitterly. "Maybe I'm just returning to the scene of the crime, probably back to where my life ended." Shelley looked shocked. "Damn, Preston, you can't be serious. Are you married, dating anyone? I mean, the kids don't say anything." "No, not really." He hadn't realized that concerned her. Damn. "I'm not who, I think I've become a bitter old man. No one wants to hang out with me, I guess." He looked up at her. "I don't even like myself these days. Every morning I look in the mirror and don't recognize the person looking back at me." It hit him for a moment. Hell, if I don't even like myself, who else is going to want to hang out with me? Now he was self-defeating. It was making him feel better. Maybe not better, but justified? Or was he hoping to do damage to the architect of his ruined life? "I guess I still don't understand why things happened the way they did." He snorted caustically. "There comes a point in my life where when I see someone happy, I get angry. Sometimes I think my only goal is to make everyone as miserable as I am." Shelley tried to interrupt, but Preston muttered, "Why did you do it, Shelley?" He wasn't even sure where the question had come from. Surely it had sounded from a deep, dark hiding place in his soul. But the fact that Shelley was clearly prospering while he was wallowing in poverty instantly angered him. He wasn't sure whether it was at her or at himself. Shelley, for her part, was very surprised and naturally assumed he was talking about cheating. So she began to explain. Preston stopped her. "I don't mean cheating, Shell. I mean, why did you tell me? Why did you confess? I probably never would have known about it." He slammed his palm angrily on the table, making Shelley flinch sharply. "I mean, you were away from home. It was some nameless and faceless man. You'll never see him again." He was almost pleading, trying to understand why his life had fallen apart. "Why did you ruin my life?" I should have told you, Preston, probably more for myself than for you. I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't." She was horrified by the realization that Preston had never moved on. "Preston, that was 20 years ago." Do you at least regret telling me about it, Shelley? He couldn't believe how calm she was. Nick Preston couldn't be wrong in his assessment. She wasn't calm at all. Stunned was the best description of her state of mind. My God, he still couldn't get over it. How was that even possible? Wow, Preston, that's a really hard question for me to answer. You don't have to. I mean, you don't have to explain anything to me. At this point, I know it's ancient history, but I'd like to understand as much, if not more. He couldn't bear to look at her intense gaze. I have my own reasons for wanting to know. I'll tell you later if you'd like. Shelley, encouraged, paused to gather her thoughts. Although it was a question she had asked herself countless times, it had been many years since she had last thought about it. Shelley had moved on with her life and was very happy with her current life. She saw no reason to bring up the past she had buried long ago. Still, his question piqued her curiosity. Besides, he seemed very desperate. Well, right after I told you well, when everything fell apart, I definitely regretted coming clean. I was really angry with myself for doing it. After a while, I transferred my anger to you. I was furious at you for not realizing, probably for not thanking me for telling you and not giving me a second chance. You didn't even let me explain, and that made me angry. Preston tried to interrupt him, but Shelley waved him off and continued. I know. It was stupid of me, but I'm telling you the truth. That's exactly how I felt at the time. However, after several counseling sessions, I came to the conclusion that it was all my own fault. I had no right to expect a certain reaction from you. She wasn't sure if she should continue and cast Preston a questioning look. Please, I need to know, Shell. Okay, Preston. She took a deep breath. When all was said and done, no, I don't regret confessing to you. First of all, I think it helped me move on with my life in the long run. Second, if I hadn't told you the truth, I wouldn't be where I am today. And my life today is so full in ways I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't be happier and more content than I am right now. Making sure he was okay with her revelations, she continued. You and I have 2 grown children who are successful and happy. My husband and I have an adorable youngest daughter. At this point, Preston intervened. Does he know about me? About us? Have you told him about what happened? Yes, Preston, I did. She snapped back. For some reason, she hated that Preston thought she hadn't. Once we got serious, I sat him down and told him everything. I also told him that it was all my fault, that you didn't deserve anything I did to you. She wasn't sure if she should continue, but she did it anyway. After all, he'd said he wanted to know the truth. Where would we be, Preston, if I had kept my secret from you? Would I have been as grateful for my life, or would my guilt have slowly consumed me and destroyed us? Sometimes I did wonder if I should have waited a little longer, wait until we were in such an unstable and vulnerable state. Preston was mortified. Shelley noticed the noticeable slump in his shoulders. Do you ever think about that time, Preston? It wasn't exactly a rhetorical question, because deep down she already knew the bitter answer. It was so obvious to her. Only once a day now, Shell. Only once a day. His shoulders slumped as he tried to keep his composure. He shook his head slowly, contemplating. This whole conversation was beginning to seem dreary to Shelley, so she quickly interrupted him. Why is repeating all of this? Shelley spread her arms wide, leaning back in her chair. So important to you? He looked at his ex-wife, once the supposed love of his life, with moist eyes. After hesitating a moment, he told her the whole story. Everything from the moment he realized he'd made a mistake by not talking to her to his brief affair with Hayden. He told her about his inability to move forward. He described to her all of his fears and failures, everything. He told her that none of it compared to his self-loathing for doing to another husband what she had done to him. He told her how the agonizing thoughts had brought him to the brink of self-harm. What kind of man am I that I could do to another what ruined my own life, Shelley? I've never been able to find a satisfactory answer to that question, one that would allow me to sleep in peace. He explained that he felt guilty for never talking to her or trying to save their marriage. 20 years of held-back anger, self-loathing, confusion, and frustration, mostly with himself, spilled out. It took him over an hour to spill himself. The whole time, Shelley just listened patiently. She remembered what a therapist had told her years ago. She had told her that it was often harder for a deceived person to move forward than a cheater. but she'd never believed it until now. Honestly, Shell, it's not so much the cheating that bothers me the most, but myself. It's more about me. Honestly, I don't know if I would have let you explain that our marriage would still be intact. But I wonder if I would have at least talked to you, tried to understand your point of view and make you understand my resentment, fears, etc. I wonder if I wouldn't have wasted all those years, most of my life. Emotions began to take over and he was silent for a moment. Maybe I would have been able to move on with my life sooner. Or maybe I wouldn't have let myself ruin someone else's marriage. What a loss. She was shocked and saddened, but to her relief, his confession didn't cause her any traumatic reaction to the past she'd left far behind. It did, however, make her feel sorry for him and wonder if there was anything she could do to show him the way forward. Shelley had an idea. It was risky, but sometimes opportunities aren't missed. The only question on her mind was it really a good idea to let a truly damaged Preston into her world? But this was one case where she could offer him a chance at redemption. It was probably the least she could do for her part in making Preston what he was. Listen, Preston, I want you to come to my house next weekend. I want you to meet my family. Your kids and grandkids will be there too. They'll all be in town for my mom's 75th birthday. It's time for you to reconnect with your family. Your children need you and miss you. They don't need me, Shell. I doubt they'll even want me at this point. She interrupted him sharply. Bullshit, Preston! She got angry and challenged his ignorant comment. They need you and miss you. It was Preston's turn to intervene. He couldn't meet Shelley's gaze. They may miss the way I used to be, Shelley, but not the way I am now. It was a pathetic statement, but perhaps a fitting epitaph to carve on his tombstone. Even Preston recognized it as such. God, what was wrong with me? Maybe. I'll think about it, Shell. You'd better show up, Preston. Don't make me hunt you down. She grinned falsely, then smiled. Unless you're going to run again. Preston sighed. I promise, Shell. I'll try to be there. It's about time, I suppose. Doubting his sincerity, she still handed him her address and turned to leave. But then a quick thought struck her and she turned to face Preston again. Hey, do you know what happened to her? To them? Honestly, Shelley, I don't know. When I got back into town, I ran into a couple of old co-workers. When I asked about her, they said that after hard times, the wife had left the state. They said they thought she had moved to California to start a new life. One of the close friends from the office told me that she had heard from Hayden's mother a couple years ago. She was moving there to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren. Apparently, she had remarried and had 3 children. According to her mom, Hayden was very happy and lived a wonderful life. As for the husband, I think his name was Ketchum. I didn't ask. I guess I was afraid of what the answer might be. I hope it worked out well for him, at least better than I did. Preston was becoming increasingly emotional, his mind cluttered with old, dark memories. I'll never forgive myself for what I did to them. Shelley didn't know what to answer. I don't know, Preston. I guess we learn as we go along. She shook her head sadly and got up to leave. Preston, I'll see you Saturday. She became pensive and just stared at him for a while. She was trying to find something else to help him. You may not want to hear this, Preston, but I had to forgive myself for my mistake, for what I did to us. Some time ago, someone told me that all was not yet lost for me, that today could be the first day of the rest of my life. All I had to do was let go of the past. Shelley wasn't sure if she should speak further, but she thought about it and decided that as painful as it would be for the best. Preston, look at me. He did so with an expression Shelley couldn't decipher. I'm really not trying to hurt you, but a few months into our divorce, I made a conscious decision that I wasn't going to let my mistake ruin my life. I had to move on. I'm sorry. I may be a horrible person in your eyes, but I had to. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. She wasn't sure she would ever see him again. For Preston's sake, she hoped she would, but either way, she wasn't going to let it change her world. Shelley had learned long ago that you can't help a person more than they want to help themselves. Preston sat silent and still, watching Shelley walk out the door. When she disappeared from his sight, he looked around the coffee shop. Somehow it surprised him that nothing had changed. People came and went. Conversations at various tables continued non-stop. The baristas taking and shouting orders didn't lose their rhythm. The world didn't revolve around him, and he didn't care about his problems. A couple hours later, however, his sterile world was shattered, but no one seemed to pay the slightest attention to it. Everything was going his way, while a seismic shift was taking place in his life. He had wasted 20 years of his life, trapped in what he thought was a fateful moment in time. It was hardly fair. Who was right and who was wrong? And did it even matter? After all, he realized that for 20 years he had allowed Shelley's actions to slow his life down. His relationships, attitudes, and emotions had stalled at that very moment. However, the woman whose actions had led to his destruction was gone, and their former life together was but a distant and faded memory. Was she the Antichrist in his world, or was it all about his self-pity and failed life? Would he be able to make it? He didn't know. Preston wasn't sure of anything except that he would definitely show up at Shelley's house on Saturday. Other than that, he would have to play it by ear.